about automated machine learning, but I'm going to start with a motivating example that we encountered during our actual work on CRISPR, which Jen is going to talk about next week. And then I'm also going to describe how you can, I'm going to mention how you can more generally use the system to optimize the parameters of any kind of experiment you want adaptively. It doesn't have to be automated machine learning. If you have a biological experiment for which you have to test, for instance, combination of drugs in different cell types, and you have a new cell type and you want to adaptively design experiments automatically, this is a good method for you. So let me start. So as I said, the goals of this talk is first, introduce AutoML as a general tool that you can use. And second, hopefully convince you that you can use the backend, not everything, but just the probabilistic model at the core of it to tune the parameters of an experiment you care about. So motivating example is our work on CRISPR, and this joint work with John Dench here at the Broad Institute and Jennifer Liskarten, who's a colleague of mine at Microsoft Research. And if you're interested in learning more, Jen is going to actually present this work and more next Wednesday at the same meeting. So let me jump right in. So what the goal of the project was to use machine learning to basically design better sgRNAs, guide RNAs for CRISPR. So let's say that you want to edit a gene. There are many guide RNAs you can design to edit this gene. Some of them work, some of them don't. And it's usually up to you to pick the ones that tend to work more than others. So what you can do is you can gather some data, basically designing various types of guides and measuring the success or not success of the gene edit from, let's say, 0 to 1. Like it worked 100% of the time or worked 0% of the time. And then what we figure is that our goal is to go from features, from characteristics of these guides to predict whether the edit is successful or not. So this is, you can see it as a typical machine learning problem. You have some inputs. For instance, the GC content of the guide could be one feature that we looked at. And you want to basically predict an output. And then given a new gene that you've never seen before, you basically want to rank the guides that tend to work in order from tend to work to tend not to work. And to do that, you need to learn this function of the guide features. So the scoop, I'm going to scoop Jennifer for next week. It tends to work well. Like what we did, we just try different machine learning models. We tuned their parameters, and we basically ended up with a model, which is the red bar, that tends to work better as measured by Spearman correlation with the truth than the existing state of the art, which was this blue bar here. So it works, but if you take a safari through our code, which is actually available on GitHub, you see that it was a crazy ride. We didn't care. We were not developing a new model. We were trying to basically cast a biological problem and a machine learning problem. We defined what success looked like. We defined a metric that we care about, which was Spearman correlation. And then we didn't care about the model. We didn't care about the parameters, but we still had to basically try everything from L1 all the way down to AdaBoost. And for any one of these, we had to basically tune the penalty, tune the learning rate, tune the sparse. It was just, maybe 5 months of work that we could have avoided. It was not adding to our knowledge. It was not particularly important to us. We just wanted a model that worked on the features we were looking at a given time. So let me focus on AutoML as a resource and a problem, and in particular as a resource for you to use. So the example that I just showed you should have convinced you that when you develop a machine learning solution for a given problem that you have, you inevitably spend a lot of time basically swapping different components, and the components could be ways to preprocess the data, individual models, the parameters of all these things, and tuning all those knobs, so changing a parameter, and that parameter maybe affects another parameter, so now you have to tune that, and you basically start thinking about these super high-dimensional spaces, but as a human, you're kind of limited, because you run an experiment, or maybe a sweep through experiments, you see how it works, and then you have to incorporate the result in your mind and figure out what to try next, and this doesn't work particularly well, we found. So let me start extremely small, extremely to the lowest possible level. Let's just fix a model and tune its knobs. So tune the parameters of this model. So as you know, like most machine learning models these days have things that you need to tune. There are hyperparameters, there are choices that you need to make, and so on. And so formally, you can basically say that you have a loss, let's say error, prediction error, that you want to minimize, and you have some model that you picked and some data that you apply this model on, and we are basically trying to change the hyperparameters such that you minimize the error. Makes sense. So this is just a formal definition of the problem. So this is actually a very hard problem to solve because for most machine learning models and for most problems, you have usually no gradients for these hyperparameters that you're trying to tune. You don't know if the direction you're going into is good or bad, second order at least. Each optimization step, so every time you change a parameter, you usually have to train the model. It can take hours. And so basically you have to just look at a few hyperparameter settings and make those observations go a long way. You cannot try thousands of things. You cannot try millions of things. You can try maybe low hundreds of things. So you need to be very smart in the way you do that. So there seems to be a consensus on how to tune parameters in the community. So there are three approaches that people typically use. One is to use a grid search. Let's say you have parameter A and B on this plot here. A is this parameter, B is this parameter, and this is how the loss reacts with respect to changes of one or the other. And you see that here, for instance, this parameter doesn't affect the loss on this axis, but this other parameter is super important. If you grid the points to try, which is what most people do, you have parameter A and parameter B. You say parameter A ranges from 0 to 1, parameter B does as well, and then you just evaluate pointed intersection of the grid. That tends to work pretty badly because you miss out on important parts of the space. So people have suggested maybe you should use random search, draw a random value for A, draw a random value for B, and try that combinations of parameters. And this seems to work better. Other people have said maybe you can fit a model to your parameters and predict how the function changes as you change the parameters, and then use that model to tell you where to go next. So the general consensus is grid search is pretty bad. Random search is a bit better. And maybe Bayesian optimization is best. Depends on how high dimensional is your problem, how it's configured, what's the response, and so on. Yeah.
Can you explain why random search is better than the grid search? I mean, your argument that you might miss a interesting peak or dip in your loss function could have been said about the random one just as easily.
Yes, so these plots actually show you the promise. So this is from a paper by Bergström and Benjo in 2012, where they argue that different parameters are relevant. So not all parameters of a model are relevant for a given data set. So some parameters, the loss function for a given data set doesn't change with respect to most parameters, in fact. So they're irrelevant for your problem. And their relevance changes from data set to data set. So if you look at data set A, parameter A may be relevant. If you look at data set B, parameter B might be relevant. And so they show this example where you have the loss function doesn't react to these changes in this parameter. You see it's flat pretty much. And it reacts to changes in this parameter. So it's not flat. And you grid them, and you see that basically you evaluate, of the interesting hyperparameter, you evaluate only these 3 points. But if you choose them randomly, like in this case, you see that you do a much more dense sampling of the relevant hyperparameter. So that's the basic idea.
So that's just a fact of the fact. That's just a kind of a corollary effect of the grid search has a bad projection onto the interesting.
Yes.
Could have a bad projection onto the interesting data.
And you might not know what the interesting one is.
I definitely don't know what the interesting.
Yeah.
So, why did you consider adaptive search? Like, instead of throwing the points randomly, you could go into the directions where the interesting things happen.
Yeah, that's kind of like the model-based. So some people call it Bayesian optimization. Some people call it sequential model-based optimization. So you define a model of how your function changes, and I have an example immediately after this slide. And you basically use that model to predict what's an interesting direction, and then based on some criterion, pick the next point to try. So the point is that works, but if you're working in very high dimensional spaces, the model that you use to predict the interesting direction tends to fall apart. Just because there are so many dimensions that it tries to model and so few observations that it's kind of flat everywhere, and it basically reverts kind of to random search. But I will show you an example next. So let me go a bit more in detail about what Bayesian optimization does. So Bayesian optimization is really the combination of a predictive model and an acquisition function. So the predictive model gives you a prediction of how the loss function changes when you change a parameter. And the acquisition function basically tells you, given that prediction, what point do I try next? Because you can get predictions. You can basically try things such as the point that has the highest predicted, the lowest predicted loss, or maybe try the point where the uncertainty is maximum. There are several ways to decide which point to try next. Traditionally, the predictive model tends to be a Gaussian process, which is a nonlinear regression method. And the acquisition function tends to be expected improvement, but there are many others that people are developing actually as we speak. So let me show you an example. In these slides, I call this loss, but it's actually not. Like I'm maximizing, so you can think about it as an accuracy. On the x-axis, you have the hyperparameter value. Let's say that you're tuning a learning rate or a sparsity parameter, like an L1 sparsity parameter. So let's see so the dashed line is the true function. So if you could observe and try and fit models for every value of the sparsity parameter, you would see that the best accuracy is here, the worst accuracy is here, and so on, but you don't typically try all of them. So the solid blue line is a predicted function. So this is what the posterior mean of the Gaussian process. So that's where the Gaussian process thinks the function is going. And the solid black dot is the point that you evaluated previously. And the red crosses are the points to evaluate next. So on the bottom, you have this acquisition function. So basically, this acquisition function takes the mean and the uncertainty and tells you which point to try next. So you basically, the red cross basically tells you you have to evaluate this point next. So we can start, and you see that, so we observe this point. The expected improvement tells us to evaluate this point. So we do, and we update the Gaussian process, and now we have a clear idea where the function is going. The expected improvement now tells us to evaluate a point around here. We do that. We change the Gaussian process again. The expected improvement tells us to evaluate the function here because you see that the GP thinks the function is going up there. So we evaluate it, but in practice, the function is actually down there. So it updates its belief and then tries a point towards this end, and then finally reaches the maximum, which is around here. So this is basically the process. You fit a model, you see an observation, you fit another model, you update, and basically do that until you're satisfied with the results. So it works. It tends to work. So if you look at a similar plot of error versus number of function evaluations, so those are the number of steps in the previous slides, you see that when you try to tune a deep neural network for a computer vision task, you see that this is the error achieved by a human, and you see that these families of automated methods actually get much better error, much lower error. The problem is that there is an asterisk when it works because it tends to work if you have few things you're trying to tune, and you're willing to wait a number of queries, so your number of evaluations that is squared with respect to the number of parameters. And most of your parameters are continuous. So there are learning rates, there are things that go between 0 and 1, 0 and 100. They don't work particularly well, these approaches, when you have categorical variables or things that are conditional. So I will go in some examples soon. And as Ben Recht said, black box optimization, this is called black box optimization. It's hard, and it's hard in the most awful sense of optimization, and it's completely intractable in high dimensions. And I completely agree. And so you can imagine that going from turning just a few knobs of a model, which people actually have been doing pretty successful, to basically going back to the full solution, trying to find an automated machine learning pipeline end-to-end, from the data to the parameters. It's pretty tough. And that's exactly the problem that we set out to solve in this talk. So we go from this loss function that just was tuning parameters to this loss function, which is basically tuning everything. So, and by everything, I mean you still have the loss and the data, but now we are trying to find the model, which model to use. Do you use linear regression? Do you use a tree? Do you use a deep neural network? We are trying to find the hyperparameters of this model. We're trying to find the way you preprocess the data to put it into the model and the parameters of this preprocessor. So we are trying to really solve the entire thing here. And this is extremely high dimensional and extremely difficult to do because you have a mixed bag of dimensions. Not all of them are continuous. Some of them are continuous. Some of them are categorical. So let's say you can choose a loss function for your tree. Some of them are conditional. If you have a tree, you have the option to set the number of the depth, for instance. But if you have logistic regression, you don't have that parameter. It disappears from your search space. Many dimensions, and this goes back to what I was saying before, many of these dimensions are irrelevant. And the relevance or irrelevance of this dimension changes from dataset to dataset, and it's very hard to predict. So my argument in this is that all of this makes this problem very hard to model, very hard to solve automatically, and you only really get a win when you have continuous parameters. So why even try?
Could you go back one slide? I just wanted to see again. Thanks.
Yeah, so this is argmin with respect to model, preprocessor, and parameters of both.
You said the computational complexity for the search is quadratic. Why isn't it exponential in the number of parameters?
Why should it be exponential?
Like a grid search would be exponential, right?
Oh yeah, but this is smarter than a grid search. So so this is the thing. Like you can show that you can show basically regret bounds. So what's the error that you make as a function of time using these sequential model-based optimization methods, and you can show that you basically, let's say you run it for 1,000 iterations. You tend to find a solution for 4 parameters or so on. Or even for 100 iterations. But then as your dimensionality goes up, you can show that the regret scales quadratically. Does that answer your?
For a given amount of work, when the dimension goes up, for a given number of iterations.
No, the number of iterations is proportional to the dimension.
Quadratic.
Yeah, quadratically.
In terms of getting to a specified
yes.
loss or
To the minimum. To the minimum of your loss, yeah, with respect to the upper parameters. So to solve this thing when you just have
right, or to get within a fixed epsilon of
or to get to yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So here's the key intuition behind our approach. Like this, you should get this. If you don't get it, just stop immediately because this is important. So I completely gave up trying to model the space continuously. I'm not doing Gaussian processes as in the first slide where you see that there is a function that changes as you change the hyperparameter. Here, all I'm doing is I'm discretizing the search space. So I'm taking PCA. I'm retaining the examples of discretized pipelines is that pick one choice for preprocessor, pick one choice for model, and then sample their parameters and keep that fixed. And you can see here some examples. You can do PCA and then follow the Bayesian regression. You can remove outliers and then apply random forest. You can remove outliers, normalize, and apply a deep neural network with some number of layers and some width and so on. So the key here is discretize and you keep them fixed.
What do you mean by keep them fixed?
So you basically treat them as recipes. The idea is that now we're going to take these recipes and apply them to a bunch of data sets without trying to change the parameters from dataset to dataset. But by keeping them fixed, we can learn things across datasets. So that's the basic idea. And as anticipated, some of the big problems in Bayesian optimization and this field of trying to, in general, find parameters using a model is that they tend to treat every dataset as an entirely new problem. So you're given a dataset, you apply these Bayesian optimization methods, and these Bayesian optimization methods forgot that learning rates that are way too large or way too low tend not to work. And this is a simple kind of prior to have, and yet not a lot of methods do it, like apply this knowledge from previous experiments. So a core part of our approach is actually to transfer knowledge across datasets, things that intuitively make sense. You cannot have sparsities that below 0 or above 1, in percentage of feature retained. You cannot, if you pick a learning rate of 10, the chances is that nothing will work and things will just bump around the space. Things that make sense. So turns out actually people have done quite a fair bit of work on this. Some people use basically a smaller data set to tune parameters of a bigger one just because you can query the smaller data set many more times because it's cheaper and then transfer your knowledge on a bigger data set. Other people basically warm start Bayesian optimization. So they kind of precede the Bayesian optimization procedure with observations obtained from a similar data set.
Could you you give an example related to your CRISPR work? Would that be like if you had, you would take your CRISPR data and then you would subset it to smaller data? Or are you talking about?
For the first one, for the subsetting,
Yeah. And for the second one, like where would you get the relevant data from?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So for the CRISPR problem, one could imagine taking data from a paper that maybe has, I don't know, one gene profile. So with 200 guides, you take that, you evaluate that, and then you apply it to your data set, which is maybe 50 genes and 40,000 guides. So you can just download it. Instead of just putting all the data together, you just query the smaller subset and then apply to the bigger subset. That would be the idea. In an image data set, you could take tiny images, like tiny ImageNet, which is requires smaller networks, and then try to transfer that knowledge to full ImageNet, stuff like that. And instead, the warm starting could be you take a general classification problem that maybe looks like your CRISPR classification problem, and you just seed the results from that. Same number of classes, stuff like that. Same class entropy. So here's our approach. So we discretize the pipelines, so we keep them as fixed, and then so that's intuition 1. Intuition 2, we want to reason across datasets. And intuition number 3, which is the core of our method, is that we treat this problem as a collaborative filtering or a recommender system type problem. And of course, here I'm a bit oversimplifying because there is an entire set of things that you need to do to make sure you're exploring and exploiting in a smart way. But basically, you can think of it as a recommender system. And you probably have seen these recommender systems in Netflix or in IMDb or in Amazon. They recommend you for things to buy or to see, to watch, and to listen to, and so on. And the way they work is, let's say you have movies and users. Users watch movies, and they rate them from 1 to 5 stars. This is very sparse data because most users don't binge watch all of their time, so it's kind of sparse data. And then given a new user that comes on your platform, you know that he or she has rated a movie with 4 stars, and you basically can use this data now to predict what the likely rating for all the other movies they haven't watched are. And basically, when the new user rates a second movie, you can update your beliefs and basically update your predictions and recommend different things. So the idea is that you iteratively refine the recommendations for a given user as this user watches more movies. You can define maybe this person likes Westerns or romance or war movies and so on. Similarly, we use a similar concept. Instead of having movies and users, we have machine learning pipelines, which are the things that I told you to keep fixed, those recipes that I was talking about, and datasets. So dataset can be anything you can download off the internet. It can be image problems, can be typical classification problems, can be CRISPR data, and so on. And instead of ratings, you have the value for the loss that you care about. So it could be accuracy, could be AUC, could be area under a precision recall curve, anything you want. And similarly, given a new data set, now you try one pipeline. Yeah.
Just wondering, do you have to have the same loss for each of these cells? Because I'm trying to think, I guess across data sets, I feel like, how do you think about defining a loss that kind of makes sense across data sets? Or does this just work with different losses?
Well, different losses. It has to be the same type of loss, like accuracy. And then you can change them to make them comparable across data sets. For instance, you can do balanced accuracy such that random is always at 0, perfect is always at 1. Because, for instance, if you did normal accuracy and you had a multi-class problem, now things would be on different scales.
I see. So there's is it true that there's some level of commonality that these data sets have to share so that you can at least define an analogous loss function across?
Yes. So you can so the way we have done this for classification problems, and we have done this for losses that range from balanced accuracy, normalized, macro average, recall, AUC, stuff like that. Things that tend to have random at the same level and perfect at the same level. And you can do it for regression too. It just becomes a bit harder because you have root mean square errors, and now the data set, can change the root mean square error quite a bit.
So just to sort of follow up, I think you sort of said it, but does the way in which you normalize seem to matter?
It does seem to matter, yes. It doesn't matter as much as you would think. So if I do this thing on accuracies where random levels are at different levels entirely, it will just take a bit longer to figure out a good set of pipelines. But but definitely putting things on the same scale definitely helps. So yeah, so we go through a new data set and we basically iteratively recommend things to try. That's the basic idea. So if you remember the Bayesian optimization slide, I said you have a predictive model, you have an acquisition function. The predictive model, well, what I'm trying to convince you of is that if you do matrix factorization, collaborative filtering, and so on, and combine it with ideas from Bayesian optimization, such as the acquisition function, this thing actually works surprisingly well. I actually haven't talked about this project much in public for the years I've been working on it because I was so surprised that it actually worked. It was not something that I would have expected because of these problems, like different problems are on different scales, and why would you, and I'm going to go in detail about the method, but why would you expect that you extract latent features from just unsupervised data and suddenly you can recommend things to try and those things tend to work in a reasonable time? So it was very surprising. So let me go a little bit more in detail about the matrix factorization part. The idea is that we have a data space, which if you remember is the set of experiments that you perform and their accuracies that you've gotten, so these red boxes. And there is a latent space. And this latent space is where you can find factors that explains data in this matrix. So in the movie recommendation example, you can think of the latent space as capturing notions about the movies. Like this movie basically is 80% Western and 20% romance, or these other movies, 100% war. Basically, you can capture things such as genres, or you can capture things such as the lead character appears in similar movies. And you're basically trying to learn these characteristics from the data itself without knowing what the movie title even is, or any data about the movie. So this is a typical unsupervised problem in machine learning. I'm not going to go in detail about the modeling unless people want me to go back and do it, but the basic idea is that there is this observed space, there is this latent space, and we relate them to each other via some kind of nonlinear function. You can write down a likelihood, basically, and I'm not, as I said, I'm not going to go in detail. What you need to know is that we relate the latent space to the observed space via what is called a Gaussian process. This allows us to find complex manifolds, so complex latent space that fold over each other and do interesting things. And as I said in the beginning, Gaussian processes are also used for regression, so you can model nonlinear functions with them, and this is just showing some examples of that. A word on missing values, because as I showed you, this matrix that we use to train our model is filled basically with 90% missing values. So we expect a lot of them, and we want basically to use a nice probabilistic model to marginalize over them, just to kind of ignore but in a smart way the missing values. And we can do that because all our observations are kind of missing at random, so this is a nice thing to be in, a nice setting to be in. So we can just basically drop missing observations from the data vector and the covariance matrix and enjoy actually a nice speed up, because now we don't have to actually compute on giant vectors anymore, but we can just subsample the data. So, and that's exactly what we do. We have this latent space, this is the observed space. If you remember the plot, the graphical model that I showed you before, you basically turn it on its side. That's what I'm trying to represent here. And basically you go data set by data set, and you only update the latent space for the pipelines that you observe in the data set. So you go to this data set, you update only these two values of X, and you move there, and in this case, you only observe the rating for one movie or one pipeline, so you only update the latent space for that, and so on and so forth. So it turns out that you can actually plot this latent space, and here I'm plotting the first two dimensions one against the other, and remember here I haven't said anything about what a pipeline contains. This model doesn't know anything. It only has observed that this pipeline tends to work well on dataset 1 and badly on dataset 100. And what you can see is, if you plot the latent space, first of all, the position of points are fixed because we learned them, and they're shared across all data sets that you might want to apply this to. And the colors, I put them based on the accuracy obtained on a given test data set. And what's interesting is that there seems to be structure in this space, and if you look at this structure, and if you look and you try to annotate what happens in the pipelines that are nearby each other, you see that, for instance, deep neural networks tend to appear in this region of the space and tend to work very well for this data set. And convolutional neural networks tend to work less well, and they're kind of nearby. And then you have random forests, which are somewhere in between the deep neural networks and the linear models on the complete other dimension, on the complete other side of dimension 1. So this is kind of strange. It seems to be capturing something about the models without actually knowing what models appear in which pipeline. The next step is combine it with the acquisition function. I'm not going to say much about this, just that basically the acquisition function we use is expected improvement. It takes in the predicted performance, the uncertainty about this prediction, and basically tells you what to do next. And it does so by basically computing how likely, and it's an expected improvement. So the expected improvement over your current best. So it's just an expectation.
Under what probability model?
Gaussian everything. So posterior is Gaussian distributed. Your performance is treated as given, as deterministic. And then it basically computes the area under the Gaussian distribution that is above your point. So that's it. But it's nice because our GP gives us Gaussian posterior, so we can do this. So here's some experiments. We basically downloaded all of the data we could find, every single classification problem we could find on OpenML. We did both classification, both binary classification and multi-class. And we picked 49 data sets at random to evaluate. Yeah, we evaluated 20,000 pipelines. So the x-axis of that matrix I showed you is 20,000. And this basically shows you a quick indication of the performance. This is what people typically show in Bayesian optimization. As you go and try more models, what's the rank of your method? So rank is 1 best to, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 worst. So you want to be on the bottom. The red line is our approach. Autoscaling, which is one of the approaches that I described in the beginning, is basically rank 2 most of the time. The dashed blue line is random search, which actually kind of works pretty well. So this is average across all 49 test data sets that we looked at. So this is the average rank per iteration.
Sorry,
Yep.
to make sure I'm understanding, so at each iteration, you are looking at a new model, like you might be looking at like random forests over here,
Yeah.
and then neural nets over there.
Yeah.
But L1 is, how is L1 changing?
Oh, L1 is, sorry, I should have said that. So L1 is basically a baseline that we implemented that tries models in the order of, based on performance on the most similar data set in L1 space. So you define meta features of each data set. You take the data set that is most similar, and basically try pipelines in the order they work, on these similar data sets. It's kind of like the stupidest baseline we could come up with, but it actually works super well in the first 5 iterations when you have no data for the model. So it's kind of like a warm, it's good at cold starting the model.
And can, I missed how you do the parameter choice within each model. Is each row in your matrix a different set of parameters, or does the row also count optimizing the parameters for the model?
It's fixing everything, including the parameters. So you would imagine you draw a sample for the model, you draw a sample for the preprocessor, and then you draw a sample for all the parameters, and that defines one row. What you can do is then you can, based on, at the end of your collaborative filtering optimization, you can just start normal Bayesian optimization to refine the parameters if you want. But now you have a ton of initialization, and you are in an area that is tiny because you got rid of most of the hyperparameters. Yeah, so this is just some plot to convince you that the model is working. What's actually most remarkable, I would say, is that the root mean square error is a function of the number of models that you've observed. Basically, I was surprised by this result. It tells you that you can predict, after you try 10 things, you can predict the performance of all of the remaining things that you could try with a root mean square error of 0.1. So that basically tells you that you try 10 models on a data set, and it can pretty confidently tell you what's the maximum performance you're ever going to get on that data set if you tried all the models that we take into account. So it's something that internally we find pretty interesting because, we get data and we try 10 things and we just say, you're going to only get an AUC of 0.76. And if we try more things, we go down eventually to a root mean square error of 0.08, but it still allows us to give pretty confident predictions about what's the best you can do. So let me show you a practical example that shows how also the model is thinking. So you can download data from Kaggle, such as this data set, which is about predicting product back orders. And this is kind of, I think, is similar to what you would do with, to what we kind of try to do with CRISPR, in fact. You get data in a giant Excel spreadsheet. You think hard about which features how to model this data in terms of featureization. Maybe you want to take into account inventory. In the case of backorder data, you want to take into account demand, seasonality, and stuff like that. And then you want to predict basically if you have to reorder a product now or not in order to avoid the backorder. And basically, this is the notebook that we came up with. And basically, this is the actual code that you need to run our method. It's just 2 lines. You just throw in the data and just let it run for a given number of iterations. And this is how it works. So on the top, you see a plot of the performance versus the number of models that you've tried. The dashed line is the performance that we could find, the best performance we could find on a notebook in Kaggle. So we just looked at all the notebooks in Kaggle that use this data, and we found that the best person, I think this is an AUC, had an AUC around 0.88. This plot is going to animate. I'm going to show you the performance of our method as you try more and more pipelines. And hopefully we go as high as possible, as soon as possible. And given that I made this, I know that we do. On the bottom, you see basically kind of like a scan of the model. It shows you what the model is thinking at any given time. On this plot, you see the predicted performance. So each dot, again, is a pipeline embedded in this space. The color changes depending on the prediction of our model. So the model might think that the pipeline works best, in which case it will be colored with a light color. And if it thinks that the pipeline is hopeless, you will see a black dot there. And this is the uncertainty of the model. This will hopefully go down over time. It will not go down uniformly. It will be focused in regions where the model has tried many pipelines. And now it starts at 1 because we are maximally uncertain about everything. And hopefully it will go down towards 0.
Nicolo, is this a problem where, what are the additional many data sets? Are you putting this together with the other data sets?
OpenML data sets, yeah. So you can basically just keep adding data as you run this model. So I can start the optimization, and you will see these 2 plots animate. You will see a red cross. The red cross is the model we are evaluating now. The green circle is the best model found so far. It's actually kind of fast. This is all the explanation. We take into account both things when trying to find out what to evaluate next. So let me start it. You see that the first model we tried was worse than what we could find on Kaggle, but now it's actually squeezing more and more performance out. The model is kind of focusing on this frontier of high-performing models and becoming more and more confident about it. And it's kind of focusing. And every now and then it goes and jumps to another area, maybe tries a model here and just colors that entire area as hopeless, don't even ever go there again. And basically at the end, you see that the best model was found in this area. We're super confident about it. You see basically we are certain. We converged pretty quickly. And the biggest jump was iteration 2, but we keep basically squeezing performance out. This is just another animation of the same problem, but on the same data, just to show you that if we had a cluster and we could run every single pipeline, we would color them like this. So this is the ground truth in some sense. This is basically tying up the MSR cluster for a month. These are a lot of pipelines to run. We did that. We just want to make sure that our predictive mean in the end was similar, at least in the areas that we actually have explored. We don't really care what happens here because we hope never to go there because things don't work particularly well. But you see that basically as we evaluate more and more things, this plot becomes more and more similar to that one. And so we are at iteration 49. And basically, again, you see that we get more and more confident. The acquisition function, which tells us where to go next, becomes darker and darker, meaning that there is less and less expected improvement to be had. And eventually, you see that we finished, and these plots look pretty similar quantitatively, qualitatively. And quantitatively, you can refer to the results I showed in terms of root mean square error on the previous couple of slides. Let me spend, yeah.
You indicated it before, but just to confirm, when you look at this plot that you just shown, is the driving factor the choice of the machine learning technique, or is the driving factor are there other driving factors like would you have on the top left corner like a neural network, and also in the bottom right corner a neural network, or they're all in the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. They tend to be close, but they tend to be close. It's hard to define it based on a 2D projection. So the plot that I showed in the beginning, where I showed that the things were close to each other, was me enforcing a 2-dimensional latent variable model. So that was kind of artificially putting things close. I expect that, in fact, different models, given that these high-dimensional and nonlinear manifolds, so you can have loops. For instance, you see, if you look at these animations as much as I have, you will see that at some point the model evaluates a point here, and it colors points on the other side of the manifold. So the defining closeness is kind of difficult. And in general, I don't expect deep neural networks to be close in this high-dimensional, nonlinear space.
The reason I ask is because if you, for example, if some new researcher comes and asks an experienced researcher, well, what technique should I use? Then you would normally say you should use, random forest or neural network. But if it actually matters what hyperparameters you have, then this advice is very useless.
Yes, I completely agree. If I go back, if you want, I can show you later. But if I go back to the slide where I do the 2D embedding, and you see, you look at the performance of linear regression, you see that there is a blob, and some of the points are red. They work great, and some of the points are blue. And the difference between the red and the blue points in that cluster is simply that some of them are penalized, and some of them are not penalized, and the penalized one don't work on that data set. So there is definitely a lot of importance from the data set.
In practice, like in this example, how many latent dimensions do you use in the factorization?
So in this example, this is a 20-dimensional example. The rank results that I showed you was a 5-dimensional, because to be fair in the comparison to autoscalearn, we had to really downsample the data sets to only use the training data sets that they use. So we had to also scale down all the variables we try to fit. So the answer is from 5 to 20. This specific example is 20 because we have more data to use.
And so the matrix that you're factoring, the sparse matrix, has, what are the approximate dimensions of that?
So it's n equals, in this data, 20,000. Dimensions are 530-ish. And we factorize in a 20,000 by 20 latent space. Whoops. Okay. Yeah, there was a question.
So after running all this, can you
Yeah.
learn anything about the sort of factory part of the data set? Like that last few percent is the same few percent of data points?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
After doing this, can you learn something about the failures, the last few percent that,
With the failures?
so like going back one slide, in the data itself?
Data itself. Oh, I see. Like
Well, sure, yeah.
this one?
No, I just meant, like you were showing that you were getting pipelines that achieve like 95% of accuracy or something like that on this particular data set.
Yeah.
So my question is, because you're able to, well, you actually brute forced it, but also before you did that, you had a vision across a lot of different models.
Yes.
Can you say something about that last 5% whatever you're taking? Like maybe intuitively, like that's being generated by some process that's different from everything else and how the models.
The example on the test data where you fail and therefore have 97% instead of 100. Is there any interesting things one can say about those as a group?
Oh, is that yeah? I don't know. I haven't looked into that, but that's something we should look at. Does that what he said represents your question? Okay, maybe let's follow up offline so that I better understand.
Another quick question for you. So if I understand your talk correctly, then you said that the performance values you set as deterministic. So you feed a data set into your pipeline, and whatever performance gets spit out, you give that to your optimizer. But aren't there like many useful pipelines that are actually either heuristically or probabilistically fit? And so the result would be different if you would run the same pipeline twice potentially.
Yeah, that's a good question. So well, one way to do that is you can, instead of giving, accuracies evaluated on a finite holdout set, you can also just give means and variances of a cross-validation procedure, for instance. So you can do that, and you can actually throw the variance into the Gaussian process, such that it actually knows what's the variance of a given data set. So we do that as well. To simplify the talk, I really didn't go into that, but we do that.
Question for you, in your pipelines, do you also include like ensemble methods, like combining user stacking or something, or is this just independent model?
Yeah, so the paper that is out on Archive right now basically does one preprocessor and one model. But by sampling from a context-free grammar, we now are actually enabling more complex pipelines. So you can combine two preprocessors, one after the other, and then apply two models in parallel and then combine them in an ensemble. Of course, it takes a lot of cluster time to actually evaluate all of these possible combinations on enough data sets to have enough data to fit the model. But yes, now we do. In the paper, we really don't. Also because OpenML datasets are kind of easy. So we get kind of like 95% accuracy in most datasets with simple methods. So going to ensembles, we wouldn't even be able to understand what the difference between different ways to ensemble models would be, just because everything would work kind of with 100% accuracy.
Also, do you need like a lot of data for this to work, or would it work in a smaller data set?
Depends which data you're talking about. The data to fit our meta model or the data on a given data set?
Yeah, the one you use for testing.
For a given data set? That is, I mean, we basically tried it on pretty much everything from 200 samples up to 20,000. So, of course, there is going to be higher variance in your estimate. So maybe you want to run cross-validation on the smaller data sets, but you can.
In practice, I mean, you do a lot of work to fit the meta model.
Yeah.
Across all these data sets that are good. So how do you view people using this in practice? They're not going to necessarily refit the meta model.
No.
So you give the meta model as part of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically, you just need to learn to know the parameters and the latent space. We train the model, we give them, and then you can just use it as a service. That's it, yeah. You can just ping it like, I tried it on this data set, this is the accuracy I got. You send it to a server. The server tells you, try model 19 now, and then you keep iterating.
How are you choosing the 20,000 different models?
Yeah, randomly, with some priors. So we basically looked at the scikit-learn documentation. We went through the list of every single classifier. We included it with the parameters, and then we used our experience to basically say, I mean, L1, goes between this and that, and with this maybe log space sampling, so the session is more dense in this area than this area, but that's the way we did it. There are better things you can do.
Are you worried about the problem you just had with bit search at the beginning, where you have some parameter values that give good results with this model that you're just missing?
That's why I was kind of like skeptical that this would work, because I was thinking if performance is sensitive to small changes in hyperparameters, for instance, we can never get it, or we can use it in a two-stage way, like fit this model, like apply this model and then do Bayesian optimization just in the neighborhood. But it turns out that actually for most problems we looked at, they're not that sensitive. So to put it actually more clearly, the variance in the evaluation of the dataset tends to be higher than the difference in performance you get for two small changes in the hyperparameters. So it becomes kind of hard to tell whether the hyperparameter really helps or you just were on a better split. And in most cases, you cannot really cross-validate for big datasets. So, yeah.
It has been mentioned already before, but I would like to emphasize. So in the field where I work, people have very small data sets. So we talk about like 100 samples. And they would use this method. So you put the 100 samples in, and whatever comes out, they would take that as ground truth. And for the next year, they would say you have to use this model. So and since on a few samples, the best model could change rapidly, it would be very helpful if you could add some sort of robustness to this answer. So if you could, in the way of cross-validation or something, like give an answer that shows that is very robust to small changes in the data set. Because I would expect that this will happen in the future, that people will blindly follow this advice.
Yeah, that's a good point. We are thinking about how to do this. So it sounds like to me like a combination of two loss functions that you care about. One is accuracy, one is stability. So we are thinking how to optimize for multiple loss functions at once. So trivially, we can do that for running time and accuracy, just to try things that are cheap in the beginning and then really scale up and make it more and more expensive. Go to more expensive models. Stability measures are definitely another thing that we're looking to do. You can easily do it in this framework. You just split the Gaussian process to have multiple outputs. It's just code, but we have the data. Sorry? There is no interface. So once this is going to be publicly available, it's going to be like a JSON call. So you can access it from R, from Python, from... there needs to be a contract on pipelines. Like we'd have to agree which models I tell you to fit and you to fit them. But after that is defined, we can easily do it in many languages. Okay. So the last 30 seconds, you can use this framework for your tuning problems. Instead of having pipelines and datasets, maybe you have drugs, combination of drugs, drug A and drug B, drug C and drug D here, for instance, and many different cell types, for instance. And given a new cell type, you want to find the combination of drugs that works best, given a metric that you care about, you can just use this framework. You don't have to use all the automated machine learning machinery, but you can just use the probabilistic framework to guide you in adaptively trying things that work better and better over time. So keep this in mind if you have a problem that you might need to tune. So for instance, we have tons of simulation problems that have parameters. And basically, Microsoft people find these parameters, and then they go away, and for a month they run on Azure and find what the result of the simulation is. So we are, for instance, using this framework to cut down on that. Maybe you don't need to run 1,000 simulations. Maybe you need to run 50, but pick them carefully using this approach. So just keep this in mind. Might be useful. So this joint work with Melly Alibol, who's a research assistant in New England, and now he's at Berkeley. The paper is an archive, and we are looking for basically all levels. We're looking for engineers, postdocs, interns, research assistants to work on this project. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.